Hello my friends, in today's video we will take a look at the best cameras that I've tested in 2020. To be honest, getting cameras for the reviews was extremely difficult for me this year, mostly because of the obvious reasons. I have still managed to review some very interesting cameras. In this video we will take a look at the best cameras across all categories that I've tested in 2020. I will start with one of my most favorite cameras that I've ever tested, which is Fujifilm X100V. This is Fujifilm's fixed lens APS-C camera with traditional styling and analog controls. X100 line has always been primarily about the shooting experience. With the V version, Fujifilm has basically completed the whole package. It uses the latest X-Trans4 sensor, which is in my opinion the best crop sensor on the market. It is paired with a new 35mm full-frame equivalent lens. The overall image quality is great. I have tested the X100V in Malaga, Spain, right before the unfortunate event started to unfold, and I can say that I really enjoyed using this one. What I appreciate the most about the X100V is the perfect combination of vintage styling and modern technology. New additions such as the tilting high-resolution screen and improved autofocus system made the shooting easier without compromising the vintage vibe. Despite that it is mainly intended for street photography, it still has very advanced video features such as real 4K DCI, 200 megabits per second codec, F-Log, and even 10-bit 422 external recording. I generally like 35mm focal length, although I would like to see 28mm X100 one day. Overall, the X100V is in my opinion a great camera, and if you are maybe burnt out on photography, it is the one to get. The second interesting camera on my list is Sony ZV-1. This is the opposite to X100V in some regards, but in a good way. ZV-1 was basically made to match the needs of modern content creators. It combines the latest 1-inch sensor with 24 to 70mm equivalent f1.8 to 2.8 lens. The whole package is extremely small. It also adds the rotating screen, which I don't like of course, but the target customers will probably appreciate that. The image quality is very good thanks to the new modern 20MP backside illuminated 1-inch sensor. This sensor is actually very close to Micro Four Thirds in terms of the dynamic range in good light conditions. Importantly, the autofocus on ZV-1 is basically perfect. It is extremely fast, accurate, and smooth. The most controversial part of the ZV-1 was actually the focal range. Some people found 24mm on the wide end to be too narrow for pointing the camera at their face. The image stabilization generally works well, but it doesn't work that great in that scenario. The battery life is similar to other 1-inch sensor compact cameras, and the user interface feels quite outdated in 2020. Unfortunately, ZV-1 still uses micro USB, and there is no excuse for that in 2020. Despite that, I still think that the ZV-1 is currently the best compact 1-inch sensor camera on the market, even for non-vloggers. An alternative is Sony RX100 VII. This is a more premium compact camera with 28 to 200mm equivalent lens. It also has a viewfinder, and I prefer the tilting screen on RX100 VII. The rest of the specs are very similar to ZV-1. Having that kind of focal range in such a small package is definitely appealing. Of course, you can't expect G-Master optical performance in that package, but the image quality is better than I would expect at that size. If you are looking for that kind of focal range, RX100 VII is definitely a valid alternative to ZV-1. I also had an opportunity to test Panasonic S5 for 2 days back in September. I think that it is a step in the right direction for the L mount. The S5 is much smaller and lighter than S1. It is just a little bit larger than the A7 III. It is still based on the old IMX410 sensor, but it extracts everything from it in terms of the video. Not all of the video specs were available when I was testing it, but it can basically match Panasonic S1H video specs. Unfortunately, that also means that it can only shoot 4K 60p with APS-C crop. Especially impressive will be the option to shoot 5.9K ProRes RAW externally. Unfortunately, the autofocus on S5 is still not good and far behind the Micro Four Thirds G9. I've been advocating for the DFD for years, but now I feel like Panasonic has run out of time to fix it, and they will lose a lot of potential customers because of that. The battery life on the S5 is just average, and the viewfinder is only borderline acceptable for a camera released in 2020. The in-body image stabilization is still solid, but as expected nowhere near the S1, which is completely fine at that size. In the end, the S5 is probably about the video specs, so if those can outweigh the inconveniences for you, it is probably the one to get. Next up we have two Fujifilm mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras. X-S10 is Fujifilm's latest mid-range camera, which offers a lot of performance in a very small package. First of all, it is much smaller than I expected based on the specs. Fujifilm was also able to pack an APS-C sensor and in-body image stabilization into an extremely small body. It uses a magnesium frame, so the build quality is at least one class above X-T30. It uses the latest X-Trans4 sensor just like the X100V, so the image quality, dynamic range, and low light performance are again great. The in-body image stabilization in X-S10 is very effective. It is much better than I expected based on that 5 EV rating. It can also work together with optical image stabilization in the lens to provide an extra stop of stabilization. The X-S10 has similar video specs as the X-T30, so downsampled 4K DCI up to 30p and up to 200 megabits per second. It can also output 10-bit 422 externally, which is a very interesting option. A big improvement is that it can shoot 30 minutes of 4K video thanks to that magnesium frame. The autofocus is generally very good. The only issue might be the smoothness if there are big focus shifts in video. X-S10 is very much on the pragmatic side of Fuji's lineup, which means that it has proper grip and DSLR style controls. There are some compromises such as the smaller battery, small viewfinder, and the lack of weather sealing. All of those are in my opinion acceptable at this size and at this price point. Fujifilm X-S10 is currently my most favorite camera under $1,000 or euros on the market. Just like with the previous two Fuji cameras on the list, the purpose of the X-T4 is basically to complete the package, in this case the upper mid-range package. And I can say that it is a very successful attempt. It uses the same X-Trans4 X processor 4 combination as the X-T3 and other Fuji cameras on this list. The important changes are the addition of the in-body image stabilization, larger battery, better display, larger grip, and unfortunately the rotating screen, which doesn't match the analog styling and controls at all. On the other hand, the video specs are great. Especially the combination of 4K DCI 10-bit 422 footage and Eterna film simulation works great. It can also shoot 4K 60p with an acceptable 1.18x crop. What I also like about the X-T4 is that it is somewhere between the vintage style Fuji cameras such as X100V or X Pro 3 and pragmatic cameras such as X-S10 or X-H1. X-T4 is a bit more on the pragmatic side, but it is still a lot of fun to use. I like the X-T4 a lot, so I actually bought one. I have already made a long-term review with my favorite lenses, which will be linked in the description. I have also continued with long-term testing and using two legendary mirrorless cameras, Sony A7III and Panasonic GH5. I have made 3 years with Panasonic GH5 video back in March, where I have concluded that the firmware updates have definitely prolonged GH5 lifespan and that the video specs are still impressive in the first half of 2020. The deal with the high-end Micro Four Thirds cameras was basically that the smaller sensor allowed the camera to have better video specs and fast shooting capabilities, and also very effective in-body image stabilization. Fujifilm X-T4 matched or even surpassed most of the GH5 specs while using a larger and more modern sensor, which means that the smaller sensor doesn't really have any advantages anymore. After very underwhelming EM1 Mark III and G100 releases, I have concluded that the future isn't very bright for Micro Four Thirds, and I have switched to X mount. The second camera that I have continued to use is Sony A7III. As I've explained in the video about my top 10 photography and filmmaking investments, a full-frame camera is a very good long-term investment in my opinion. Even when it gets a bit outdated, it will still be able to provide that rich full-frame look, shallow depth of field, low light performance, and if it has Sony sensor, a very decent dynamic range. A7 III is not really outdated though. Panasonic S5 and Nikon Z6 were released just recently and both use the same sensor as the A7 III. In a way, the A7 III will kind of be a new release next year after the A7 IV will be released. It will move down to upper mid-range class and it will continue to be a valid choice for a long time. It will still be a complete camera with great sensor, flawless autofocus, compact size, full-frame 4K video, dual card slots, great battery life, and so on. The display, viewfinder, and the menu is a bit outdated by 2020 standards. 4K 60p and 10-bit video would also be nice, but those are nice to have rather than must-have features for most users. I think that the A7 III will be a great mid-range camera with a very strong E-mount ecosystem and nice upgrade path already available. Next up, we will take a look at my 3 most favorite consumer cameras of 2020 and one disappointment. My most favorite consumer camera of 2020 is DJI Pocket 2. I wasn't sure about a couple of the specs, but I can say that DJI has made it work. Because of that switch to 20mm focal length, it is basically a different type of camera than the Osmo Pocket 1. I think that 20mm is a good compromise between the neutral 26mm focal length of the Osmo Pocket 1 and 16mm ultra-wide lens that vloggers were asking for. It still looks much more classy than the action camera footage and it makes a lot of sense in combination with a gimbal. 20mm focal length is easier to stabilize, so the walking with Pocket 2 looks much better than with Osmo Pocket 1. Despite that it uses a 64MP sensor, DJI was able to get the video processing right, and the video quality is excellent. A new function is digital live cropping, which is basically a better form of digital zoom. To my surprise, it is actually very usable. The colors are also very nice, and the new D-Cine-like setting is properly flat. I generally think that the Pocket 2 is a great all-round camera for modern content creators, and I intend to use it a lot next year if the situation allows it. A close second is Insta360 One R. One R is a modular camera system that has brought some great innovations just when we thought that there is no room for improvement in action cameras. Especially the 1-inch mod is very impressive. That one can shoot beautiful 5.3K video, which is a class above any other action camera. 360 mode can turn it into 360-degree camera, and 4K mode is good for all-round use. It uses special metadata, which makes it possible to utilize excellent flow state stabilization and reframe the footage after it was shot. There is a lot to talk about with the One R, so if you are interested, full review will be linked in the description. One R also has a great ecosystem of accessories that will significantly increase your creative options. There have also been some significant firmware updates since I have made my review, so I will revisit One R in early 2020. A bit of a disappointment for me is GoPro Hero 9 Black. Hero 9 got a lot bigger, but it still uses 1/2.3-inch sensor. It is a new 20 megapixel sensor which can shoot 5K, but I don't think that the image quality is any better than with the Hero 8. Unlike the DJI, I don't think that the GoPro was able to get the video processing quite right. Two undeniable improvements are a larger screen, finally, and a larger battery. Replaceable lens is also back, which is how it should be. I definitely don't think that it is a bad action camera, but my expectations were much higher, especially in terms of the image quality. I think that the One R is a much more innovative action camera, and I would get it over Hero 9. Last but definitely not least is my most favorite smartphone camera of the year, which is iPhone 12 Pro. The main reasons why I still prefer an iPhone with a small main sensor are the video quality, HDR processing, and the stabilization. The rest of the phone is also great in my opinion, and I'm a big fan of flat edge design, so that might have contributed to that. Just like the 11 Pro, 12 Pro still uses triple camera setup with 13, 26, and 52mm lenses. I think that this is a very versatile combination. The main camera uses a new lens with f1.6 aperture, which captures a bit more detail in comparison with the 11 Pro. The HDR processing actually got a lot more tasteful in 12 Pro. I've been surprised by how well it handles some very difficult high dynamic range scenes. I still hope that Apple will be able to put 1/1.7-inch sensor to 6.1-inch iPhone in the future, but for now I am very happy with the camera setup in 12 Pro. So these were my most favorite cameras that I've tested in 2020. The three cameras that stood out for me were Fujifilm X-T4, DJI Pocket 2, and again Sony A7 III because of how well it aged. I hope that this video was somehow useful for you, and if you are interested in some of these cameras, there are full reviews available on the channel. I will probably make a similar video about the best lenses, so stay tuned for that. So that's it for this video, thank you for watching, I hope that you liked this video and that you have found it to be useful. Stay tuned for more videos and maybe consider subscribing if you don't want to miss my future content. I appreciate your feedback in form of thumbs up or thumbs down. If you would like to ask anything or share your opinion, please do so in the comment section, and see you next time.